Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, U.S. Secretary Tillerson has embarked on a tour of 5 Latin American nations. Can he convince, though, that America first includes South America, too? And I speak with the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, Mr. Fatih Birol. I find out what is shaking up the world's energy market. You're watching World Insight. We start today's show with a big diplomatic event on the American continent. The U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is on a 6-day trip to 5 nations in Latin America and the Caribbean. But what made more headlines was his speech before the trip, suggesting that Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro could be toppled by his own military and warning Latin American countries that China is the so-called imperial power. But to what extent, though, does the region agree with him?
Venezuela might be the last nation in the world to applaud Tillerson's Latin America trip. The U.S. official said America is considering sanctioning oil.
And is it a step that might bring this to an end, to a more rapid end and a more rapid close? Because not doing anything to bring this to an end is also asking the Venezuelan people to suffer for a much longer time.
Last week, Tillerson suggested that Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro could be toppled by his own military, something reminding Maduro of imperialism.
The Venezuelan opposition has inherited the arrogance, the imperial arrogance of believing that with a button, an order, a plan in English, the Bolivarian Revolution is finished.
Interestingly, Tillerson bashed other nations as new imperial powers in the region last Thursday before he started his diplomatic trip.
Today, China is gaining a foothold in Latin America. It is using economic statecraft to pull the region into its orbit. Latin America does not need new imperial powers that seek only to benefit their own people. The United States stands in vivid contrast. We do not seek short-term deals with lopsided returns.
A claim that not all Latin American nations will agree on. China is already the largest trading partner of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Peru, all of which are destinations on Tillerson's itinerary. Late last month, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with 33 members of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States in Chile. He also invited them to become part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Another thing that Tillerson and his Latin American counterparts may not see eye to eye on is the almost 200-year-old Monroe Doctrine that he praised. This U.S. policy opposed European colonialism in the Americas beginning in 1823. Some say that those who once suffered from imperialism know best what imperial power means. In this sense, Latin Americans will always have a bigger say than Mr. Tillerson.
So the question is, can Tillerson mend ties between Latin American countries and the United States? To answer that question, we have a very strong panel. In Beijing, we have Mr. Jiang Shizhe, professor of Shanghai University. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Beijing, Charles Tang, traveling all the way from Brazil. He's the president of Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Welcome as well. Good to see you here in Beijing, Charles.
Thank you.
And also joining us in Washington, D.C., we have Benjamin Kresfeld, who is a postdoctoral fellow for China, Latin America, U.S. Affairs with the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Welcome. And in Washington, we are also joined by our longtime analyst, Joe Rubin, president of Washington Strategy Group and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Welcome to all of you, gentlemen. I want to start with Mr. Rubin, if I can. Can Mr. Tillerson, as Secretary of State, be able to fulfill his mission, namely mending fences with Latin American countries and making sure that the Latin American countries might not necessarily like China that much?
Well, good morning, and for Secretary Tillerson to reinvent his mission towards Latin America, he needs to have a team, and he needs to have a president who's willing to cooperate. And right now, he has neither. There is no Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary leader that is at the State Department for Latin American affairs, and the president continually attacks Latin American countries. And adding to that, we have a policy towards Latin America on trade and immigration that is very much creating tensions with the region. I myself, I served in Latin America for several years in the Peace Corps. I understand sensitivities there. When the Secretary says that the Monroe Doctrine should be the American policy, it really grates. So Latin Americans don't want to be told what to do by the United States. And right now, this administration is failing to engage rather than dictate what they want to see done.
Mr. Tillerson did praise the controversial 1823 Monroe Doctrine that enshrined America's dominance over Latin America. It is still seen by many as a form of U.S. imperialism, according to some in Latin America. He defended the doctrine, saying, I think it is as relevant today as it was the day it was written. We have Charles Tang sitting here, coming from Latin America, from Brazil, namely. Mr. Tang, in your country, for example, and some of the other countries in your neighborhood, what do people make of this doctrine?
Well, of course, you know, for many, many decades, Latin America always said, Yankee go home, and Yankee imperialism go home. Because, you know, nobody likes to be ruled by a big stick, such as the Monroe Doctrine, whereby you impose your wishes by the strength of force, and you install dictatorships against the will of the people, military dictatorships. And some of these military dictators have depleted the treasury of their countries for their own benefit. So I don't believe that that is the right approach to attract the Latin American sensitivities.
Then let's go to Mr. Cresfield. I mean, you know, President Trump talked about El Salvador as so-called one of those shithole countries. We don't want to repeat those phrases too many times. Secondly, Monroe Doctrine has been once again mentioned by Secretary Tillerson, well knowing the Latin American countries might not really like it. But the question is why? Why repeatedly offending Latin American countries a prelude and during a trip to Latin American countries? Mr. Cresfield, can you help us to understand this?
Well, it is, of course, a sign of the dysfunction that we see in Washington that Mr. Rubin just referred to, that there are different camps, and some are trying to build walls, others now go out, like the Secretary of State, to mend fences, and contradictory messages come out in this sense. It is certainly insensitive, somewhat undiplomatic to start off by using referring to the Monroe Doctrine. That is problematic. I think it's meant to be an outreach, poorly worded outreach, because the Monroe Doctrine, we have to remember, has been reinterpreted over the last couple of 100 years, so there have been attempts to make it sound more inclusive. It was part of the argument to create the Organization of American States. So if you look into it cleanly, there are some positives to be found in the Monroe Doctrine, but it just puts everyone's hair up on end. And one Peruvian columnist said this is a 19th century visit to Latin America, not one that should be just used for this century.
Got it, that ancient. And therefore, people wonder whether some of the other phrases being used are ancient too. For example, imperial power. That was one phrase used toward China by Secretary Tillerson, putting ideologies aside. Mr. Jiang here helping us to understand this. China argue China does not have any military base in Latin America, do not have any military presence in Latin America, and is mainly trying to do business with Latin American countries. But, you know, as a scholar working in Latin America for a long time here from China, Mr. Jiang, what do you make of this kind of comment from your perspective? What exactly is the nature of things that China is doing in Latin America? Is China trying to use, you know, like a new era imperialism? Is that what China trying to do?
No, definitely not. Well, Tillerson's words, I would say, I want to use the word selfish or jealous or groundless. China's relationship with the region has been going on for 1 or 2 decades. And I would like to point out that China's trade with the region or China's investment in the region are beneficial for economic growth and social development.
But the question is being raised whether China is trying to exert a political power and influence with its economic input over there.
No. I don't believe so. Well, some people...
You don't believe so, or it is not doing it?
It is. China is not doing the kind of thing you are talking about. Well, some people in the U.S. say, well, China helps Venezuela. Without the support from China, Venezuela, the government in Venezuela will collapse. But that's a kind of cooperation in the economic field. Now, let me add one point. We talked about the so-called Monroe Doctrine. It is very interesting to note that the former Secretary of State, John Kerry, said many years ago, or some years ago, the Monroe Doctrine is over. So I don't know why Tillerson says the Monroe Doctrine.
Well, there are different parties, as you may know, and this is a very different administration. You may know that, sir, as well.
Now, China, the Chinese investment has created almost 2 million jobs for the region.
Okay. All right, there we go. We want to go back to our panelists also in the United States. So here's the thing. The argument has to be made in a way that has to be convincing. So how can the United States convince Latin American countries that it is their friend and they should be working as partnership? That is by offering advantages for development in Latin American countries rather than so-called providing an umbrella. So Mr. Rubin, here it comes to you because you know this region very well. Let's just go to some of the countries being mentioned here. Mexico, Colombia, Peru, some of Jamaica as well, Mexico, NAFTA, almost being scrapped off at this point. And Mexico said, if the United States do that, Mexico is not going to fulfill its responsibilities of whether guarding against the illegal immigrants or fighting against drug trafficking. Having said that, the thing is, what can America offer?
This is the core question, and for the United States, Latin America is a key region. It's our primary region of partnership, and we have had decades, going back to President Kennedy when he went in the early 1960s to Latin America and Central America in particular and attempted to build a compact, and we have in Washington the Organization of American States headquartered here and the Inter-American Development Bank headquartered here. Building partnerships between the United States and Latin American countries, promoting development, taking care of the environment, dealing with issues like poverty, education. These are real issues, democracy, that we have been working closely with Latin America for a couple of decades at a minimum, if not longer, in very intensive ways. Even Plan Colombia, a major effort to stop drug flows from Colombia to the United States, $1 billion program, which really turned around the situation. So the United States has these partnerships, and there is, we have to be clear, there is a competition with China in Latin America for the United States. Competition is normal. Competition is understood that this is going to happen. China wants to influence countries towards its side on certain issues, as do we. But the problem with the language right now is that it's not language that is bringing Latin Americans over to our side. We are not making the pitch and the argument about why it's good to be associated with the United States. Domestically, the president is describing people from Latin America in very negative terms, countries in Latin America in very negative terms, and the Secretary of State is building on that. So we have a real potential to push away our natural allies in Latin America.
The same question I want to put to Mr. Tang, because you're coming from Latin America countries. What can the United States offer when they says there has to be a partnership? What is this partnership about?
Well, you know, like my colleague said, the United States used to try to help develop the Latin American countries. At the same time, they also installed terrible dictatorships. However, today, after building the wall and calling Latin Americans and Central Americans and Caribbean people like using very, very nasty terms. I don't think that is the way that he will be very successful in his trip to attract the Latin people. Furthermore, you know, China's business is business. China's footprint is development and prosperity. China's business is not war, and its footprint is not destruction and suffering.
But you are the president of Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Probably you would say so, very positive about China. But what about the rest of your country? Do they believe so as you do?
Well, it's not a matter of believing or saying. It's a matter of numbers and hard facts.
What are the numbers, if you are saying?
Well, Brazil has received over $100 billion of investments from China, which really helped Brazil very much during the crisis that it went through. It's coming out of it, slowly coming out of its crisis now. But you have to understand that all the Latin American, Caribbean countries have the same dream as all human beings.
What is?
Prosperity and development. And China does not interfere with the internal affairs of any of the countries.
All right.
China does not send its troops or marines. It sends its businessmen to trade and to invest.
Okay, well, we hear this side of the argument. Let's go to you, Mr. Kreisfeld. China promised to double trade with Latin American countries in the next few years, invest enormously, a few $100 billion even, dollars right now on the price tag. So what can America offer? If it is a competition, if it is not a competition, the partnership has to be about something. What is that thing?
Well, certainly development is something that all those involved all value and aim for, but I would nonetheless say there's got to be a little more reflection here, both from the Chinese side and from the United States. I mean, the United States clearly, Mr. Tillerson has used some, brought up some awkward terms that don't necessarily make his trip easier, and the US needs to look for some more cooperation and see what Latin American countries want, also emphasizing that, that Latin America is still an extremely important trading partner for the United States, export partner, and a fifth of the region's foreign direct investment still comes from the United States. So there's still a lot going on, and the US should build on that and look for some cooperation. And China needs to understand a little better that you can say till you're blue in the face that there is no ulterior motive, there is no political motivation, but there are cultural efforts. And unfortunately, if you're involved in extractive industries, that is in some way destructive. That is necessarily enters into conflict, as we've seen, with indigenous peoples, with all sorts of minorities, with environmental groups, and that's something that has to be addressed and recognized.
All right.
And then building on that, one could maybe find some cooperation. This idea of competition is probably not helpful.
Got it. Mr. Jiang responded to our to Mr. Kreisfeld that whether it is competition, first of all, secondly, whether China should pay more attention to the benefits of the local when China is trying to seek a partnership with Latin American countries, also on a very different project.
Well, can I answer your question like this? Well, there are so many partners for the region, US, China, Japan, Europe. There are several partners, and out of these partners, I would say the U.S. still controls the so-called position of dominance over the region in terms of market, capital flow, technology, migration, all kinds of things. So I would say China is not going to challenge this kind of traditional dominance of the U.S. in the region. China wants to complement this kind of the so-called this kind of partnership. So China wants to cooperate with the U.S., Europe, or Japan in Latin America.
What China wants may not necessarily mean that what Latin American countries want. Let's just listen to Mr. Tang. Let's hear what he has to say about that point.
You know, China has become Brazil's largest trading partner and largest single foreign investor. It's no longer the United States that is the largest trading partner, and that is goes the same way for many, many of the countries.
The picture is changing.
Absolutely. Today, in most of the Latin American countries, you will find that China is the #1 foreign trade partner and the #1 foreign direct investment country.
All right, we have an interesting discussion. Our discussion will continue because all of you said Secretary Tillerson seemed to have said something that he himself would not necessarily going to invent. So is he carrying on the rhetoric tradition of the president, or is he believing in the so-called framework, if there is any, of the U.S. foreign policy for this administration? We're going to continue about that right after this break. You're watching World Insight. Tillerson's job of winning over Latin America is made harder by the so-called America First policy of President Trump. Trump appears to have ignored U.S. commitments to Latin America, some say. In his first year in the office, he has withdrawn the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He has threatened to scrap off NAFTA. He has cracked down on immigration and scuttled a temporary protected status program for Salvadorans and Haitians living in the United States. He has also insisted on building a border wall. We all remember that. And he has referred to some Central American countries and Haiti in very bad language, which we might not be necessarily want to repeat at this point for a proud public broadcaster position. So let me come back to all of you gentlemen about this. The question is, Mr. Tillerson, is he trying to sit on his chair by reciting the rhetorics of this administration, namely the words of President Trump, or that is exactly what he believes in ideologically? Let's go to Mr. Rubin. Your analysis.
Well, I don't think Secretary Tillerson came in with a clear ideology on foreign policy. He had no foreign policy background, and now he's trying to organize it with the president behind him whose language is extraordinarily dangerous for American national security. And so Secretary Tillerson is trying to put many things together while at the same time his State Department doesn't have confidence in his leadership. And we see the results, which is an incoherent message, oftentimes a message that offends the people that are trying to be spoken to rather than engages them.
But he is still the Secretary of State. I mean, he could walk away. He could say, I don't agree. And he could also suggest that he's trying to balance as much as possible while he is in the office. It really depends on how he argues about that. Mr. Kreisfeld, of course, it's no secret that there is a very much difference between his way of thinking and the president, given the earlier drama that the media have beautifully reflected. But the question is, what's next?
That is difficult. There is, as I said earlier, an element of dysfunction and contradiction, and there are different camps within D.C. And I've spoken with people at the State Department who would argue that, for example, when it comes to China specifically, there isn't a very clear unanimous view in D.C. on what China really means in Latin America, what it means to U.S. interests. And so different scripts overlap and contradict each other at times. I think, in some sense, what is most significant is that, and the least surprising, is that Secretary Tillerson is pushing for something you can call oil diplomacy from a former, oil company CEO. That's not surprising when he sees that Venezuela still sells most of its oil to the United States.
So your argument is?
So that's something that is. Well, I would simply say that there is still some dysfunction and that there is still something in formulation. And my argument would be, one thing I would add is that there has been some reporting on ongoing conversations. We focus very much on this current visit, but actually, for example, talking about NAFTA with Mexican Foreign Secretary Videgaray, he's been meeting regularly in D.C., so there have been some quieter dialogues that may...
Yeah, will the so-called quiet diplomacy taking place under the huge rhetorical umbrella gonna make us going anywhere, Mr. Jiang? Your analysis, very briefly.
Nowadays, it will be very hard, very difficult to understand the politics in the U.S. Well, only just 1 month ago, Trump was in Beijing, and we had very good conversation, and Trump said, well, his dialogue with President Xi Jinping was chemical.
So you mean Chinese are also confused?
Yeah. So,
okay.
so it's really difficult.
It's no secret that you are confused.
to know why Tillerson said these kind of words.
All right, but people are looking at it, Mr. Tang, that maybe this year is going to be very different from last year. It seems that the administration is turning its rhetoric against China, but at the same time, without necessarily having an overall strategy when it comes to foreign policy, for example, with Latin America. Mr. Tang, your take?
Well, you know, while the U.S. is trying to impose the Monroe Doctrine of carrying a big stick to beat upon the Latin countries, China really reaches out to try to make friends with the Latin, Caribbean, and the world. I just came back a few weeks ago from Chile, where Foreign Minister Wang Yi was there in the China Latin America Caribbean Conference, organized by CGTN. People even call Ms. Lei Hong, Mrs. Lei Hong, who does this, as the ambassador of China for the Latin American Caribbean countries. And a month and a half ago in Punta del Este, over 700 Chinese people and thousands of Latin Americans were gathering to discuss their mutual collaboration.
But the question is, will this be sustainable? Is it all backed by dollars?
Well, it's backed by the aspirations of the whole world and the people who want to develop, who want to have the things they never had before. And China is giving them an opportunity without interfering into their, for example, the fund, the 2/3 of the money of the fund in Brazil, the bilateral fund for infrastructure, is Chinese. And 1/3 is Brazilian, but the governance is 50-50. So this is the type of approach that Latin America needs so that they can aspire to their development.
We're running out of time, but this is such a rich topic. I'm sure, gentlemen, you will be invited back to further discussion about this. For now, I want to thank the four of you. I have a very strong panel. Jiang Shi, Charles Tang here in Beijing, Benjamin Kreisfeld, and also Joe Rubin in Washington, D.C. What a pleasure to have all of you, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you so much. You want to stay with us here on World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program.